Swiss Guard broke protocol at Pope Francis' funeral. His reaction shook the entire Vatican. But today there was no chatter, no laughter, only a heavy, almost tangible silence. Word had spread quickly across the world that Pope Francis had passed away. People who had admired him, who had followed his guidance and teachings, were mourning. And in the heart of the Vatican, an extraordinary event was about to take place, one that would forever be remembered, not for the grandeur of ceremony, but for a small act of humanity that would touch many hearts. Among the thousands gathered in St. Peter's Square was Matteo, a young Swiss Guard. At just 22 years old, he had already spent years preparing for this role. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every strap aligned just so. The red, blue, and yellow of the ceremonial costume gleamed under the early morning sun. Matteo had spent hours practicing the rigid formations and precise steps required for events like this. From the outside, it might have seemed that the Swiss Guard simply stood and walked, but behind every move was countless hours of training and unwavering discipline. Today, however, Matteo's heart felt heavier than any training could prepare him for. The streets around the Vatican were filled with people who had come from all corners of the world. Some were pilgrims, walking long distances just to be near the Holy See. Others were dignitaries and religious leaders, dressed in formal attire, their faces solemn and their eyes reflecting grief. The air was filled with a mixture of incense and the faint echo of distant bells, creating an atmosphere that was both sacred and intense. It was a day of mourning, yet it also carried an undercurrent of hope, as if the world had paused to reflect on the life and legacy of a man who had dedicated himself to peace, compassion, and service. As Matteo took his position near the entrance of St. Peter's Basilica, he felt the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. Every visitor, every official, every clergy member moving through the area relied on the Swiss Guard to maintain order. Their presence was meant to reassure people, to show that even in times of grief, the traditions of the Vatican would be upheld. Matteo had trained for moments like this, but nothing could have prepared him for the emotional intensity of the day. He glanced around and noticed the crowd. Some were silently praying, heads bowed, hands clasped tightly together. Others were wiping away tears, struggling to contain their grief. Matteo's eyes were drawn to a small group of children, their faces a mix of curiosity and sadness. They had heard stories of the Pope's kindness, of the way he had reached out to the poor, the sick, and the marginalized. Now, standing in the presence of his passing, they seemed to understand in their own way the magnitude of what had occurred. The young Swiss Guard could feel the collective energy of the crowd pressing in from all sides. Each person carried their own memories, their own personal connections to Pope Francis. For some, he had been a spiritual guide, a source of comfort during difficult times. For others, he had been an inspiration, someone who had reminded them of the importance of compassion and humility. Matteo thought about his own life, and how he had always admired the Pope from afar, never imagining that one day he would be standing just feet away from the place where the world would say its final goodbye. Time seemed to slow as the hours passed. The quiet was punctuated only by the careful footsteps of the Swiss Guard, the soft murmur of prayers, and the occasional rustle of fabric as clergy members adjusted their robes. Matteo remained vigilant, his posture perfect, his eyes scanning the crowd. He was trained to notice the smallest details, the slightest movement, a hint of unrest or someone in need of assistance. But amid the solemnity and discipline, Matteo's mind wandered, filled with memories of the Pope's teachings. He remembered reading about how Pope Francis had emphasized kindness above all else, how he had encouraged people to look beyond themselves and extend a helping hand to those in need. As he stood there, Matteo noticed a nun approaching from the back of the crowd. She was elderly, her steps slow and unsteady, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. The nun's hands trembled slightly, gripping a small rosary that seemed almost too large for her frail fingers. Matteo watched as she struggled to navigate the crowded area, her pace disrupted by the sea of people surrounding her. In that moment, he felt a surge of empathy. Protocol dictated that he maintain his position, that he do nothing to disturb the careful balance of order and tradition. But seeing her difficulty, he knew that he could not simply stand by. He shifted slightly, making room with his presence rather than moving out of line entirely. His heart raced, and a tiny bead of sweat formed at his temple, but he focused on the nun, guiding her with a gentle nod and a soft gesture toward the path she needed to take. She looked up at him, eyes wide with gratitude, and whispered a quiet thank you that seemed to resonate more deeply than any words could convey. In that brief exchange, Matteo realized that this moment, small and seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of the funeral, was what truly mattered. The world outside the Vatican might never know his name, might never see the act of compassion he had offered in that fleeting moment. But Matteo understood that sometimes the smallest gestures held the greatest power. The nun continued on her path, her steps steadier, and Matteo returned to his position, heart still pounding but mind at peace. He had chosen humanity over rigid protocol, and in doing so, he had honored the very essence of what Pope Francis had always stood for. As the morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the square, the preparations for the funeral continued. Choirs rehearsed softly, incense burned steadily, and the procession of clergy members began to form in anticipation of the ceremony. The atmosphere was a delicate balance of solemnity and anticipation. Every detail mattered, every movement was scrutinized, yet beneath the layers of tradition and formality, there was a quiet reminder that even in the most structured environments, human kindness could shine through. Matteo took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. He thought about the millions of people who would watch this funeral from around the world, their eyes glued to screens, their hearts heavy with grief. They would see the grandeur, the ceremony, the perfect alignment of every detail. But few would notice the small, quiet acts that made the day truly meaningful, the gentle guidance of a struggling nun, the reassurance of a young guard who chose empathy over protocol. He glanced once more at the crowd, feeling a connection to every individual present. Their grief, their hope, their reverence, it was all intertwined in a single shared experience. Matteo knew that this day would be remembered not only for the passing of a pope, but also for the moments of humanity that occurred quietly, almost unnoticed, amidst the formalities. And in his heart, he felt a quiet pride, a sense of purpose that went beyond any rules or regulations. As the hour of the funeral approached, the air grew heavier with anticipation. The bells tolled, echoing across the Vatican, signaling the beginning of the sacred ceremony. Matteo adjusted his posture once more, ready to fulfill his duty, but deep inside he carried with him the knowledge that the smallest acts of compassion could have a lasting impact, sometimes more powerful than any tradition or protocol. Today he was part of history, not because of the uniform he wore or the rules he followed, but because he had chosen to act with kindness in a moment that mattered. And so, with the sun climbing higher in the sky and the world watching with bated breath, Matteo prepared himself for the most important moment of his young life. He did not yet know how the events of the day would unfold, or how a single, quiet act could resonate far beyond the walls of the Vatican. But in that moment, standing among thousands, he felt a deep and unwavering certainty that humanity, compassion, and empathy were forces more enduring than any protocol or tradition. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of St. Peter's Basilica, illuminating the polished marble floors with a soft, almost holy glow. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Every corner of the grand cathedral held echoes of the past, centuries of tradition, of ceremonies, of countless faithful who had walked these halls in moments of joy, mourning, and devotion. Today, it was the latter. The entire Vatican had come to a solemn standstill, awaiting the funeral of Pope Francis. Outside, crowds pressed close, eager for even a glimpse of the procession. Inside, everything had to be perfect, every detail meticulously planned, every movement carefully rehearsed. Matteo, standing among the ranks of the Swiss Guard, felt the weight of his role more keenly than ever. His uniform gleamed under the light, his posture stiff, his eyes scanning every inch of the cathedral. He had been trained for this, drilled in the precise movements and strict discipline that marked a Swiss Guard's duty. Yet, despite all his preparation, Matteo felt a sense of uncertainty creeping in. The grandeur and precision of the funeral were awe-inspiring, but they were also intimidating. Every person in the room, from cardinals to visiting dignitaries, was watching closely, aware of the historical significance of the moment. As the ceremony began, the solemn notes of organ music filled the space, mingling with the quiet prayers of the attendees. The chants of the choir rose and fell like waves, creating an atmosphere of reverence and sorrow. The scent of incense lingered in the air, curling around the pillars and weaving through the crowd like an invisible thread, connecting all present in shared grief. Every step of the procession was timed to perfection, every gesture deliberate and meaningful. The Swiss Guard, known for their disciplined precision, moved in perfect synchronization, their eyes alert for any sign of disorder or disturbance. It was during this carefully orchestrated moment that Matteo's attention was drawn to a small figure in the crowd. An elderly nun, frail and unsteady, was making her way toward the center of the cathedral. Her steps were slow, each one requiring careful effort. She clutched her rosary tightly, her knuckles white against the beads, and her eyes, though filled with determination, betrayed a hint of fear. The crowd was dense, and people shifted constantly, making her path treacherous. Matteo's instincts, honed through years of training, immediately kicked in. He noticed her struggle, the slight tremor in her hand, the uncertainty in her steps, and he felt a surge of empathy he could not ignore. The rules were clear. The Swiss Guard must maintain position at all times, no matter the circumstances. Protocol was absolute. Any deviation could be seen as a breach, a failure to uphold centuries of tradition. But Matteo had always believed that rules existed to serve humanity, not to overshadow it. He took a deep breath, weighing his options in the briefest of moments. Standing by and watching was the easier path, the one that would guarantee safety from reprimand. But he could not ignore the nun, could not allow her to stumble in a crowd that was so tightly packed. Without fully realizing it, Matteo stepped forward, moving with quiet precision to create a path. He kept his movements controlled, his posture formal, but his eyes were soft, focused entirely on the nun. "This way, sister," he murmured gently, his voice almost lost in the hum of the crowd. The nun looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. She had not expected assistance, and yet here it was, offered with kindness rather than formality. With Matteo guiding her, she began to move more steadily, her steps gaining confidence. It was a small act, almost imperceptible to the many thousands around them, but for the nun, it was everything. As they moved together, Matteo felt a strange mixture of fear and calm. Fear, because he knew that any deviation from protocol could bring consequences. Calm, because he felt he was doing exactly what Pope Francis would have wanted, helping someone in need, even in the most formal, ritualized of settings. He could hear the whispers of other guards behind him, subtle but distinct, signaling surprise at his actions. Some glanced sharply, a mix of curiosity and disapproval in their eyes. Yet Matteo did not falter. His focus remained on the nun, ensuring her safety as she navigated the crowded path toward her place near the coffin. The nun finally reached her spot, bowing her head in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling but sincere. Matteo nodded, a quiet smile brushing his lips. There was no applause, no official recognition, just the shared understanding that in that moment something human had triumphed over rigid formality. He returned to his position, standing tall once more, heart still pounding but mind at ease. It was a small victory, perhaps unnoticed by many, yet profoundly significant. Around him, the ceremony continued with the utmost solemnity. Cardinals and bishops moved in precise formation, carrying the casket of Pope Francis with care and reverence. Their robes flowed elegantly, their faces grave, reflecting the immense responsibility of honoring a man who had touched so many lives. Cameras and journalists captured every moment, broadcasting the event to millions worldwide. Every gesture, every expression, every detail was scrutinized, analyzed, and remembered. And yet, amid the grandeur and formality, Mateo's small act of compassion remained quietly significant, a reminder that human kindness could exist even in the most structured of environments. As the funeral progressed, Mateo's thoughts wandered. He remembered the stories of Pope Francis, of his humility and devotion to service. He thought about the times the Pope had reached out to the marginalized, the poor, and the suffering. He thought about the lessons he had learned, both in life and through his own service, about empathy, courage, and the quiet strength found in helping others. Standing in the midst of centuries-old tradition, Matteo realized that these lessons were not just abstract ideas. They were meant to be lived, demonstrated in the smallest, most human moments. Suddenly, a commotion near the back of the cathedral drew Matteo's attention. A young boy had wandered slightly off course, separated from his family in the dense crowd. Panic was visible in his eyes as he looked around, unsure where to go. Instinctively, Matteo moved toward him, creating space with his presence, just as he had done with the nun. "It's okay," he said softly, guiding the boy gently back toward his parents. Relief washed over the child's face, mirrored by gratitude in the eyes of the parents. Another small act, another quiet moment of humanity that went unnoticed by most, but was deeply felt by those directly involved. The rest of the funeral unfolded with the same precision and reverence, the music rising and falling like a sacred tide, carrying with it the prayers and grief of everyone present. Matteo remained vigilant, moving only when necessary, yet always keeping an eye out for those who might need assistance. Each moment reinforced his belief that his role as a Swiss guard was not only to uphold tradition, but to serve humanity in its most vulnerable moments. As the casket was lowered, Matteo felt a deep sense of connection to everything around him. He thought about the thousands of pilgrims who had traveled from faraway lands, braving long journeys and difficult conditions to pay their respects. He thought about the cardinals, the bishops, the clergy, and the countless faithful whose lives had been touched by Pope Francis' words and actions. And he thought about the small gestures, acts of kindness, moments of empathy that made this solemn day not only a ceremony but a profound reflection of the Pope's teachings. By the end of the morning, Matteo had become aware of something remarkable. In a place known for strict protocol and centuries of tradition, small acts of compassion could create ripples that touched countless lives. His assistance to the nun, his guidance of the young boy, and his quiet presence had not disrupted the ceremony. They had enhanced it, bringing a subtle but powerful humanity to an otherwise rigidly structured event. He realized that, while the world often focuses on grandeur and spectacle, it is the simple acts of care and kindness that leave the most lasting impressions. As the ceremony drew to a close, the final prayers echoed through the cathedral, and the choir's voices soared one last time. Matteo remained in position, heart full, knowing that his actions, though small, had honored Pope Francis in the truest sense. Tradition had been upheld, yes, but humanity had been celebrated as well. And in that quiet balance between discipline and compassion, Matteo understood the essence of his service: to protect, to guide, and to show care even when it went unnoticed by the wider world. The sunlight had climbed higher in the sky now, bathing the cathedral in warmth. Outside, the crowds began to disperse, but the memory of the day, the solemnity, the grief, and the moments of unexpected kindness would linger long after the last bell had tolled. Matteo knew that history would remember the funeral of Pope Francis for its grandeur, for its adherence to tradition, and for the thousands who had gathered to mourn. But he also knew that those small, quiet acts of humanity, the ones unseen by the majority, were what truly made the day extraordinary. And so, as Matteo stood there, proud yet humble, he felt a deep connection to everything around him: the past and the present, tradition and compassion, duty and empathy. The day had begun with tension and uncertainty, but it was ending with a quiet affirmation that in moments of loss and ceremony, humanity could shine brighter than protocol, and kindness could echo far longer than the most precise drill or perfect formation ever could. As the funeral procession continued, the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. St. Peter's Basilica, a place steeped in centuries of history and tradition, seemed almost to hold its breath. The air was thick with incense, the soft murmur of prayers, and the quiet shuffle of footsteps moving in perfect synchronization. Every detail mattered. Every motion was watched. Every gesture was noted. And yet, amid the grandeur and solemnity, the human heart still sought connection. Matteo, standing among the Swiss guard, felt the tension rise with each passing moment. The events of the morning, the nun he had helped, the young boy he had guided, had left him with a strange mixture of pride and apprehension. Pride because he had acted with compassion, showing humanity even in the midst of strict protocol. Apprehension because he knew that the slightest misstep, however well-intentioned, could be noticed by his superiors. The eyes of the Vatican were always watching, and discipline was not a suggestion. It was absolute. As the procession approached the altar, the casket of Pope Francis was carried with utmost care by the clergy. The polished wood gleamed under the soft lighting, and the surrounding guards maintained their positions with unwavering attention. The crowd remained silent, their grief palpable in every whisper and sigh. The choir sang in delicate harmony, their voices weaving through the cathedral like threads connecting every person in shared sorrow. And then it happened, an unexpected moment that would forever be remembered by those who witnessed it. A sudden shift in the crowd drew Matteo's attention. An elderly woman, leaning heavily on a cane, had lost her balance. She was pressed between the marble railing and other mourners, struggling to steady herself. Panic flashed across her face, and a few people nearby reached out in hesitation, unsure how to help without causing more disruption. Matteo's training told him to hold his position, to maintain the formality required of the Swiss Guard. But instinct and empathy surged stronger than protocol. Without a second thought, he moved swiftly, carefully stepping around the crowd, his eyes locked on the woman. "Sir, may I assist you?" Matteo said softly, his voice calm and steady. The woman looked up, startled at first, then relieved. Matteo placed a steady hand on her elbow, guiding her safely to a more secure position. Each step was deliberate, measured, as he ensured she would not stumble or fall. Around him, a few guards whispered, some with surprise, some with concern, but Matteo ignored them. The woman's grateful smile and relieved sigh were worth any reprimand. It was a small act, yet profoundly human, and in that moment it felt as if the cathedral itself recognized the quiet courage of his choice. Once the woman was safe, Matteo returned to his position, straightening his posture and adjusting his uniform. He felt his heart racing, adrenaline coursing through him, but also a quiet calm. He had done the right thing. He had acted as Pope Francis would have acted, prioritizing compassion over rigid formality, and yet he could not ignore the subtle glances from his fellow guards. Whispers traveled like ripples across the ranks, and Matteo knew that his actions had been noticed. As the funeral reached its most solemn moments, the casket was lowered onto the platform for the final rites. The choir's voices soared higher, the prayers grew more intense, and the congregation's emotions swelled. It was a moment meant for reflection, for reverence, for remembering a life that had touched millions. And in the midst of it all, Matteo felt a strange connection, not just to the ceremony, but to every person present, every mourner, every soul united in grief. He realized that his role, though seemingly small, was a bridge between protocol and humanity, between tradition and empathy. Suddenly, Cardinal Giovanni, a senior church official who had watched the morning's events closely, approached Matteo. His face was grave, yet there was a softness in his eyes. He leaned slightly, speaking quietly but with clear intent. "Your actions, they are noted," he said. There was no reprimand, no disapproval, only recognition. Matteo felt a wave of relief mixed with awe. The cardinal's approval was more powerful than any formal commendation, for it came from someone who understood the delicate balance between discipline and compassion. The recognition did not stop there. As the ceremony progressed, several attendants and clergy members, who had observed Matteo quietly throughout the morning, nodded subtly in his direction. It was as if a silent understanding had passed among them. Humanity, even within the strictest structures, deserved acknowledgement. Matteo's heart swelled. He had not sought recognition, but the acknowledgement was a quiet affirmation that his actions mattered. They were small, yes, but significant in a place where every detail was scrutinized and every gesture carried meaning. The final prayers were recited, and the choir's voices softened, creating an atmosphere of calm reflection. Matteo felt his own emotions rise, a mixture of sorrow for the loss of Pope Francis and profound gratitude for the chance to witness, and even shape, moments of human connection. Around him, mourners bowed their heads, whispered prayers, and wiped tears from their eyes. Every gesture was a testament to the impact of a man who had lived with humility, kindness, and unwavering commitment to others. And Matteo, standing silently yet purposefully, realized that he too had contributed to that legacy in the smallest but most genuine way. Outside, the sunlight had shifted, casting longer shadows across the square. Crowds began to stir, some moving closer to catch a glimpse of the procession, others finding quiet corners to offer personal prayers. The Swiss Guard continued their duties, maintaining order and ensuring the ceremony proceeded without disruption. Yet beneath the surface of protocol, there was a subtle warmth, a recognition that the human spirit, when guided by empathy, could shine even in the most formal settings. Matteo's thoughts wandered to the countless stories he had heard about Pope Francis, the outreach to refugees, the visits to hospitals, the quiet encouragement of those facing hardship. Each story had seemed remarkable in its own right, but now, standing amidst the ceremony, Matteo understood their deeper significance. It was not only the grand gestures but the countless small acts of kindness that had defined the Pope's life. And today, Matteo had been part of that continuum, demonstrating, in his own way, that compassion was not limited to clergy or leaders. It could be embodied by anyone, at any moment, even in a world governed by rules and tradition. The atmosphere inside the basilica shifted as the ceremony neared its conclusion. The clergy began to offer final blessings, their voices resonant with reverence and love. Attendees rose and fell with synchronized grace, following centuries-old rituals with precision. And through it all, Matteo remained alert, ready to act if needed, yet filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had upheld his duties, respected the ceremony, and yet had also made space for the simplest, most human acts. In a place known for strict rules and formality, that balance was extraordinary. After the final blessing, as the congregation slowly began to disperse, Matteo noticed the subtle expressions of gratitude from those he had helped earlier: the nun, the elderly woman, and even the young boy with his parents. Each glance, each smile was a quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding that his actions had mattered. It was a reminder that influence and impact are not always measured by grandeur or recognition, but often by the small, meaningful gestures that touch lives in profound ways. Cardinal Giovanni approached once more, this time with a slightly more relaxed expression. "You reminded us today," he said softly, "that rules serve humanity, not the other way around." "Thank you." Matteo felt a warmth rise in his chest, a mixture of humility and pride. He had not sought this acknowledgement, but it confirmed what he already knew, that the simplest acts of kindness could resonate far beyond the immediate moment, touching hearts in ways that protocol alone never could. As the day drew to a close, Matteo reflected on the unfolding events. The funeral of Pope Francis would be remembered around the world for its solemnity, its precision, and its historical significance. But Matteo understood that what mattered most were the human moments, the quiet gestures, the acts of empathy, the choices made to prioritize compassion over strict adherence to rules. Those moments, small yet profound, carried the true essence of the Pope's teachings. Walking through the basilica one last time before the doors closed, Matteo felt a deep connection to history, tradition, and humanity. He had witnessed grief and devotion, discipline and empathy, order and spontaneous kindness, all intertwined in a ceremony that was both formal and profoundly personal. And he knew that the ripples of these small acts, though subtle, would extend far beyond the walls of the Vatican, touching hearts in ways no one could fully measure. As sunlight faded into the soft glow of evening, Matteo took one final look around. The rows of pews, the polished floors, the towering ceilings, they all held the weight of centuries. Yet it was the small, human moments that would endure in memory, that would echo in hearts long after the bells had stopped ringing and the visitors had left. Matteo realized that this day had taught him something invaluable, that even within the strictest structures, kindness could shine, and empathy could resonate further than any formality ever could. And so, standing silently, proud yet humble, Matteo felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The day had been a test of character, discipline, and humanity. He had upheld tradition while embracing compassion. He had followed orders while listening to his heart. And in doing so, he had participated in a moment that would be remembered not only for its grandeur, but for its quiet affirmation of the power of human kindness. The afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the Vatican as the final moments of Pope Francis' funeral approached. Outside, crowds of mourners lingered, reluctant to leave, their voices hushed and their faces marked with sadness. Inside St. Peter's Basilica, the grand cathedral remained filled with a solemn reverence. The ceremonies had followed the time-honored traditions, every step executed with precision, and yet beneath the rigid structure, something far more human had taken place. Matteo, standing among the Swiss guard, felt a mixture of exhaustion and quiet pride. His body ached from hours of standing and alertness, but his heart was full. He had acted on instinct, guiding those in need, assisting the vulnerable and balancing discipline with empathy. At first, he had worried that his actions might be seen as a breach of protocol, a misstep in a ceremony that had demanded perfection. But the subtle recognition from Cardinal Giovanni and the gratitude of those he had helped reassured him. He realized that true service was not measured by strict obedience alone, but by the humanity behind every action. As the procession concluded and the casket was lowered for its final placement, a hush fell over the congregation. Every person present seemed to feel the weight of the moment, as if the entire world had paused to honor one man's life. Matteo observed the faces of the mourners, some tear-streaked, some serene, others reflecting a quiet awe. Each expression told a story of connection, faith, and the impact of Pope Francis' life. For Matteo, it was a reminder of why he had chosen to serve in the Swiss Guard, why he had dedicated himself to upholding both tradition and humanity in moments of profound significance. The nun he had helped earlier approached him once more, her steps steady and confident. She offered a gentle smile, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Matteo nodded, a soft smile returning in kind. It was a small exchange, easily overlooked by others, yet deeply meaningful. In that fleeting moment, the connection between human beings, the simple act of care and consideration, felt more powerful than any ceremonial gesture or grand procession. It was a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness could resonate far beyond the moment they occurred. As the mourners slowly began to leave, the Swiss Guard maintained their positions, ensuring that order was preserved and that the solemnity of the day remained intact. Yet Matteo noticed something remarkable. People were looking beyond the ceremony itself. They were noticing gestures of care, subtle acts of attention, moments where humanity had quietly prevailed over formality. His guidance of the elderly woman, the young boy, and the nun had left impressions that, while invisible to most cameras, were etched into the hearts of those involved. These acts of compassion became small ripples, quietly spreading throughout the cathedral and beyond. Word of Matteo's actions began to circulate among the clergy and staff within the Vatican. Though no official announcement was made, whispers of recognition and appreciation traveled from one room to another. The cardinal's quiet acknowledgement had been enough to confirm that Matteo's choices had mattered. Other guards and attendants who had observed his calm and caring actions began to reflect on the meaning of duty. They understood that service was not just about following orders. It was about observing the needs of those around them and responding with empathy. In a place as disciplined and tradition-bound as the Vatican, this realization was both subtle and profound. Matteo's thoughts drifted to Pope Francis himself. He thought about the Pope's lifelong commitment to humility, kindness, and service to others. The stories of the Pope visiting the sick, comforting the lonely, and encouraging the marginalized were not mere anecdotes. They were lessons in living with compassion. Today, Matteo had tried, in his own small way, to embody those lessons. He had chosen action over inaction, empathy over rigid procedure, and in doing so, he had contributed to a legacy that extended far beyond the walls of the cathedral. Outside the basilica, the crowds began to thin, but the sense of reverence remained. People spoke quietly, reflecting on what they had witnessed. Some shared memories of Pope Francis, others offered prayers for guidance and strength. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, they spoke of the moments of human kindness they had observed, the gentle guidance of the nun, the care shown to those struggling to navigate the crowded space. These moments, though small, became part of the collective memory of the day, evidence that even in the most formal and rigid ceremonies, humanity could prevail. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the square, Matteo walked slowly through the cathedral, allowing himself a few moments of reflection. The polished marble floors reflected the light, the grand columns seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, and the stillness of the space encouraged quiet contemplation. Matteo realized that the true impact of the day was not in the perfection of the ceremony, but in the subtle, human acts that had occurred within it. These acts, invisible to most, were a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the strength of empathy. He thought about the lessons he had learned in the past few hours. He had learned that rules and traditions, though important, were not the ultimate measure of service. He had learned that even small actions could carry immense significance when performed with care and sincerity. And he had learned that humanity, the willingness to see and respond to the needs of others, was the most powerful force in any structured environment. These realizations filled him with a sense of purpose and clarity, reinforcing why he had chosen this path in the first place. Later, as the final guests departed and the cathedral began to quiet, Cardinal Giovanni approached Matteo one last time. There was a calm, deliberate look in the cardinal's eyes, a recognition that went beyond words. "Today," he said softly, "you reminded us all why service is not only about discipline, but about compassion. You have honored Pope Francis in the truest sense." Matteo felt a wave of humility and gratitude. He had not sought praise, yet the acknowledgement affirmed that his actions had mattered in ways he could scarcely have imagined. Matteo spent the next moments observing the emptying cathedral. Candles flickered softly, their light reflecting on the polished floors and carved stone. The air was heavy with incense, yet lighter somehow, filled with the echoes of prayers and whispers of gratitude. He thought of every person he had assisted, every small gesture he had made. In his mind, these moments were more significant than the grandeur of the ceremony itself. They were living proof that even in a world governed by tradition, empathy could prevail. Word of Matteo's quiet acts eventually reached beyond the walls of the Vatican. Though the media focused on the ceremony itself, those who had been present shared their stories. Pilgrims recounted the Swiss guard who had gently guided the elderly, comforted the vulnerable, and acted with unexpected humanity. Clergy and attendants spoke of the guard who had chosen compassion over strict protocol. The story spread quietly, a testament to the idea that small gestures of kindness could have profound effects. Even in a setting where precision and discipline were paramount, humanity left an indelible mark. Matteo reflected on how this day would stay with him for the rest of his life. He realized that the true measure of his service was not found in the perfection of his posture or the alignment of his uniform, but in the moments where he had chosen to act with empathy and care. These moments, though simple, were lasting. They were reminders that true courage and strength often manifested in the quietest ways, in helping someone stand, in guiding a lost child, in showing kindness when it was needed most. The evening air outside the Vatican was cool and calm, carrying with it the distant sounds of prayer and reflection. Matteo stepped out into the square, the grandeur of the basilica looming behind him, a silent witness to the events of the day. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment, aware that he had been part of something larger than himself. He had upheld tradition, honored a beloved leader, and yet also embraced the power of empathy and human connection. The experience had left an imprint on him, shaping not only his understanding of duty, but also his appreciation for the quiet, powerful ways in which one person could make a difference. As the day came to a close, Matteo walked slowly through the Vatican gardens, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. He thought about the countless people who would remember today, the mourners, the clergy, the pilgrims, and the moments that had gone unnoticed by the cameras and headlines. These moments, small yet profound, were what truly defined the day. They were proof that even in the midst of rigid structures and long-held traditions, humanity could prevail, leaving lasting impressions that no ceremony alone could achieve. Matteo realized that this day had changed him. He had witnessed grief and devotion, discipline and compassion, protocol and humanity, all intertwined in a single, unforgettable experience. And in reflecting on his actions, he understood a deeper truth. That service was not just about following orders, but about seeing the needs of others and responding with care. It was about balancing tradition with empathy, precision with humanity, and duty with kindness. As darkness fell over the Vatican, Matteo stood quietly, looking at the illuminated facade of St. Peter's Basilica. The bells rang one last time, echoing through the square, a solemn reminder of the life that had passed and the legacy that remained. Matteo felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a quiet pride, and an unwavering belief in the power of small acts of kindness. Today had been a day of history, yes, but more importantly, it had been a day of humanity. And so Matteo left the cathedral, carrying with him the lessons of the day, the importance of empathy, the strength of quiet courage, and the enduring impact of small, meaningful acts. He knew that even in a world governed by rules, traditions, and expectations, humanity would always find a way to shine. And in that understanding, he felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that he had honored Pope Francis in the truest way possible, not just through ceremony, but through compassion, care, and unwavering humanity.